Konnichiwa, class. I'm Professor Goku, and welcome to another session here at Superhero Seminary. You know, I gotta say, one of the absolute coolest things about being a Saiyan, as you American kids say it, has got to be that I can fly. When I was little, I used to fly around on a cloud. Then as I got older, I learned how to do it on my own. No clouds needed. It's basically second nature to me at this point. It's pretty great, I'm not gonna lie. I know this makes a lot of you envious. You guys would love to be able to fly. And that's what I want to talk about today in class. Flying. Specifically the idea that someday all Christians in the world are gonna fly through the air to meet Jesus, who will be coming on a cloud to take them away to heaven before unleashing massive destruction on the earth. You may know of this as the Rapture. I mean, even people who have never set foot in a church think the Bible teaches that at some point in the future Jesus will make a partial return to earth to snatch believers away in a massive invisible worldwide disappearance, leaving behind empty cars, cribs, planes, and in case of rapture, this t-shirt will be unmanned shirts. But it may come as a surprise to many Christians and non-Christians alike that the Bible does not, in fact, teach any of this. Now, if you've seen Professor Thanos' lecture here, where he looks at the famous Left Behind passage, you know that Jesus was actually saying the exact opposite of what most people assume in that verse. But what about the even more famous Rapture passage? That's where I want us to turn today, class. Now, Paul wrote this in response to questions that they had about church members who had recently died. East Thessalonian Christians wanted to know if those departed saints would somehow miss out when Jesus comes back. Now, before we look at the passage itself, I want to tell you about a couple of crucial concepts that the Thessalonians would have been pretty familiar with. The first one is the arrival of an important ruling official, otherwise known as a parousia. See, in the Greco-Roman world, when a person of great importance was coming to visit a town or city, in anticipation of his parousia, or his arrival, citizens would go out to meet him in a public and joyous celebration. This was a momentous event, and there's actually a specific term for it. It was known as an apantesis. Here's how the Pocket Lexicon to the Greek New Testament defines it: the act of meeting, or to meet. A phrase seemingly almost technical for the reception of a newly arrived official. Cicero wrote about the apantesis that he imagined Caesar to be receiving from adoring citizens all around the empire in 49 BC. Look what he says. Just imagine what apantesis he, Julius Caesar, is receiving from the towns. What honors are paid to him. The municipalities are showing the boy, Octavian, remarkable favor, wonderful apantesis and encouragement. We even see apantesis celebrations in the Bible. When the translators of the Septuagint were describing the arrival of the Ark of the Covenant to a town, they used this term. It's in 1 Samuel 6:13. Now the people of Beth Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley. When they looked up and saw the ark, they went with rejoicing to meet it, apantesis. And likewise, when believers got word that Paul and Luke were coming to their town in the book of Acts, we read, the believers from there, when they heard of us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns to meet us. Even Jesus uses the word in his parables. But at midnight there was a shout, look, here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him. The early church father, John Chrysostom, who himself was a Greek speaker, writing not long after the time of the New Testament, describes the concept of an apantesis like this: for when a king drives into a city, those who are in honor go out to meet him, but the condemned await the judge within. The famous New Testament scholar F.F. Bruce summed it up this way: when a dignitary paid an official visit, a parousia, to a city in Hellenistic times, the action of the leading citizens going out to meet him and escort him back on the final stage of his journey was called the apantesis. So class, keep this in mind. When a ruler was coming to a city over which he reigned, crowds would go out to meet him in celebration in order to then follow along behind him in a procession back into the city. And this brings us to our second important piece of cultural context. When an apantesis was happening, it was a huge celebration, and people would often get caught up by the crowds and hurried along with them in the excitement. That's literally the verb that's used to describe getting swept up in the moment by others. Harpazo. Harpazo literally means to grab or seize suddenly so as to remove or gain control, to snatch or take away. But it's also used as a figure of speech to describe getting carried away by others for an important event or meeting. That's how Josephus regularly uses it to describe Claudius being ushered away by his soldiers, in fact. And in the New Testament, it's used with this same figurative meaning both by Jesus and Paul, who were in danger of being caught up by zealous crowds on different occasions. So, to sum up, when a victorious ruler arrived at a town or city, the loyal citizens would go out to meet him in a loud public joyous celebration in which people people would be caught up in all the excitement. This was a known phenomenon throughout the Greco-Roman world, including Thessalonica. Are you with me so far, class? Now, with all that in mind, turn to 1 Thessalonians 4 and look how Paul answers the questions the believers there had about whether their fellow Christians who had died already would miss out on Jesus' return. He says, "Brothers, we do not want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep, or to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. We believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Lord's own word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left till the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who've fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage each other with these words." Did you catch that, class? Paul is describing the ultimate apantesis. He's drawing on the well-known imagery of a royal arrival, but using it to describe not some puny earthly ruler coming from the north, south, east, or west on a measly chariot. No, he's talking about the King of Kings, who is seated at the right hand of the Father in heaven, coming back to claim his kingdom in fullness once and for all. But this passage is where the term rapture comes from. See, when the New Testament was translated into Latin, the word rapiemur, which means to be snatched up, was used to translate harpazo. And that's where we get the English word rapture from. But does this being caught up refer to Christians literally being whisked away into the clouds in a massive disappearance act, leaving behind a confused world that will then go through 7 years of horrible tribulation until a final Antichrist figure emerges from somewhere in Europe, according to most versions of rapture theology, and attempts to destroy the city of Jerusalem in a massive Chinese, Russian, Iraqi, Iranian invasion, only to be stopped by Jesus' visible return to reign on the earth 1,000 years from a throne in Jerusalem? Whew, that's a lot to recount in a single paragraph. In short, no, class. That entire scenario was first put forth beginning sometime in the 1850s and evolving through various prophecy conferences and correspondence Bible courses put together by 19th and 20th century preachers and evangelists, and it was cemented into the fabric of American fundamentalism and later evangelicalism through the Scofield Reference Bible. Now, for much more on the historical development of this view of the end times, go ahead and check out the Apocalypse Now audio course available for free here on the Disciple Dojo podcast. Click the link at the top of your screen for more. Now, as exciting as that whole scenario is, it's important to realize most Christians throughout history and around the world have not held to such a view of this passage. Rather, they've recognized that Paul is talking about the final return of Jesus as conquering king to judge the quick and the dead, as the Apostles' Creed puts it. He's not talking about invisibly snatching Christians up to heaven for a few years until he really comes back. Paul's talking about the very visible and very final second coming of Jesus, what we call the resurrection of the dead. And he's doing so using the unmistakable vocabulary of Greco-Roman imperial rhetoric, which as Thessalonican readers would have easily recognized, but which we today are not quite as culturally familiar with, so we often misunderstand it to be talking about snatching people up literally into the clouds. And it's not just me saying this. Scholars from many denominations and theological traditions all recognize that what's going on in 1 Thessalonians 4 is nothing like what we see in so many presentations of the rapture in pop theology. For example, the New Bible Commentary on this passage says, "The picture is that of a group of citizens going out from a city to meet a visiting dignitary and accompanying him back. This implies that the Lord returns with his people to the earth." This language was probably never intended to be understood absolutely literally. It's describing things that go beyond words. The important thing is that believers, whether the dead or the living, are from then with the Lord forever. The Dictionary of Biblical Imagery says, in describing the second coming of Jesus, the picture of the faithful meeting the Lord in the air, in 1 Thessalonians 4:17, is drawn from the practice of coming out of a city to welcome a returning warrior who has been successful in battle. And in his commentary on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, New Testament scholar Ben Witherington says, "But it was also the case that a royal visit to a city would be announced by a herald, and might well also be announced by a trumpet blast meant to alert those in the city that the king was coming. This imagery is pursued further in verse 17 with the use of the term apantesin, to meet. This word refers then to the actions of the greeting committee as it goes forth from the city to escort the royal person or dignitary into the city for his official visit. Paul's Thessalonian audience may have missed some of the allusions to the Old Testament, but they would not have missed the language used here about a royal visit, indeed an imperial visit. They would remember the visit of Pompey and later Octavian. N.T. Wright puts it this way: so when Paul talks of Christians being snatched up among the clouds, he is again not thinking of a literal vertical ascent. The language here is from Daniel 7, where one like a son of man goes up on the clouds as he is vindicated by God after his suffering. A wonderful image, not least for people like the Thessalonians, who were suffering persecution and awaiting God's vindication. And their meeting with the Lord doesn't mean that they will be staying in midair with him. They are like Roman citizens in a colony, going out to meet the emperor when he pays them a state visit, and then accompanying him back to the city itself. And even scholars who don't believe that the Greco-Roman apantesis is a precise parallel to what Paul is describing admit that he is deliberately modifying its imagery for his own rhetorical purposes. We should admit that Paul deliberately reverses conventional expectations, which would actually fit what we know about his use of other convention. Paul tends to modify existing language and cultural norms when communicating with his audience. In 1 Thessalonians 4:13-17, the custom of the Hellenistic formal reception is part of the cultural background for Paul's thinking. When he speaks of the coming of the heavenly king, he would probably have had in mind some aspects of the pomp associated with the great receptions he had witnessed or heard about. In Paul's mind, the coming of the monarch from heaven will far exceed the glory of the most magnificent reception ever lavished on a Greek or Roman king. And the late British pastor and theologian John R.W. Stott, who is widely considered the elder statesman of evangelicalism, sums up the message of this passage beautifully. It is not clear how literally we are to understand being caught up in the clouds. We know from Jesus himself that his coming will be personal, visible, and glorious. But we also know from him that it will not be local, there he is, here he is, but rather universal, like lightning which flashes and lights up the sky from one end to the other. Presumably, therefore, our going to meet him will also transcend space. And that's what this passage is about, class. It's not about people flying out of the air invisibly in some massive disappearing act. No, this passage is about the promise that not even death can separate the king from his loyal subjects. And what better image is there to use if you want to describe this glorious reception that we all will experience, dead or alive, when the king returns, not from some earthly battle, but from being seated at the right hand of the Father. This passage isn't about Christians being beamed up to heaven. This passage is about heaven coming to earth, which is what the Bible ends with a picture of in Revelation. So given the fact that neither Jesus nor Paul ever taught that Christians would be raptured out of the world before the final return of Christ, and given that the only proof texts for such a concept don't actually teach it when we look at them in their biblical context, perhaps it's this theology of an invisible rapture that needs to be left behind. That's all for this session, class. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out our other Superhero Seminary videos here on the Disciple Dojo YouTube channel. If you like them, if you think they're ridiculous, if you think they're challenging, go ahead and subscribe and share them with other people. Feel free to leave your comments in the comment section below. We love to hear feedback. And again, for a much fuller and, well, a more serious look at this entire subject, be sure to check out the podcast series, Apocalypse Now, What the Bible Teaches About the End Times. It's entirely free here on the Disciple Dojo podcast. Go check it out.